A new stage in relations between the United States and Russia. The hour-and-a-half conversation between the presidents of Russia and the United States was a turning point in international politics. The leaders agreed to start official negotiations on the settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, which will take place directly between Moscow and Washington. The director of the CIA, National Security Advisor and Special Envoy Steve Utkov will take part in them. Special attention was paid to the preparation of a face-to-face meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, which is likely to take place in Saudi Arabia. The leaders discussed the prospects of visits to each other, recalling the times of the Second World War, when their countries cooperated as allies. This has become a symbol of the possible warming of relations between the two powers after a long period of tension. Ukraine is out of negotiations, the end of old diplomacy. The most painful thing for Vladimir Zelensky was that the US notified him about decisions taken after the fact, without giving him an opportunity to participate in discussions. This was a final rejection of, not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine, which Kiev and the EU had previously insisted on. This step was a diplomatic shock for the president of Ukraine, who until recently had been perceived as a key ally of the West. Now, Kiev's opinion does not interest not only Russia, but also the US. Moreover, Trump's administration has made it clear that further restoration of Ukraine will be a responsibility of the EU. According to reports, the cost of restoration will primarily be borne by Germany. Economic blow. Rare earth metals and debt dependence game. The only thing that really interested Trump in Zelensky's recent statements were rare earth metals, which Ukraine has a lot of. The United States needs these metals to develop high-tech industries and maintain strategic independence from China. Finance Minister Scott Bessent was sent to Kiev to assess the reserves of these resources. Documents for economic cooperation are planned to be signed with US Vice President Jed Wessels in Munich, with whom Zelensky reportedly has extremely tense relations. This agreement effectively means that Ukraine will become economically dependent on the United States. Washington's proposed conditions are extremely harsh, and Zelensky is forced to accept them in order to maintain the remaining support from the West, but this makes him even more vulnerable. Painful rejections. NATO and peacekeeping forces. Trump dealt a particularly painful blow to Zelensky's ambitions by categorically refusing to fulfill Kiev's key demands. He bluntly stated that the issue of returning to the borders of 1991, Ukraine's accession to NATO and the deployment of American peacekeepers had been finally closed. Even more humiliatingly, this was announced in absentia without taking into account the opinion of the Ukrainian side, putting Zelensky in an extremely difficult position both on the international stage and inside the country, where many expected more decisive action from the president. Cold reception and diplomatic isolation were the result. Zelensky couldn't even get a phone call with Trump, and the White House made it clear that any contact with Kiev would be possible only after resumption of dialogue with Moscow, which was not only humiliating but also extremely dangerous politically, as it questioned his authority as leader of the nation. Economic control. The US dictates terms by controlling financial flows aimed at supporting Ukraine's army and economy. Trump is dictating his own terms. Washington expects Zelensky to follow instructions and express his position as minimally possible. European reaction. Shock and confusion. Trump's decisions caused shock in Europe. The president said he will continue to support Ukraine but only if spending commitments are fulfilled. At the same time, he said there is no threat in negotiations without Ukraine. This statement was a shock for Brussels, which had hoped to continue support for Kiev. Europe will have to take responsibility for rebuilding Ukraine, causing discontent in European capitals. Zelensky is losing influence. Ukraine loses influence. The Ukrainian president finds himself in a situation where his opinion no longer matters to key global players. American journalist Jackson Hinkle noted that Zelensky would simply be informed of the results of the negotiations, without inviting him to the process itself. This highlights the political isolation of Kiev, which is turning into a bargaining chip in a big geopolitical game. Signals from the Kremlin. Moscow's conditions. Vladimir Putin has made it clear that freezing the conflict in Ukraine is not an acceptable scenario for Moscow. Russia insists on eliminating the root causes of the conflict, including U.S. interference in Russia's vital interests. Prospects for a peaceful settlement. Despite the start of negotiations, the prospects for lasting peace remain unclear. The conflict in Ukraine is likely to last longer than the crisis in relations between the United States and Russia. Historical context. The collapse of Russia's isolation. The Times noted that Trump's call to Putin symbolized the collapse of the Western strategy for Moscow's diplomatic isolation. This confirms that Russia is once again becoming an influential player in the international arena. Prisoner exchange. The first step towards warming relations. The phone conversation took place after the prisoner exchange. Russia released American Mark Bogle, and the United States returned Alexander Vinnik. This was the first step towards normalizing relations. Conclusion. The beginning of a new era in world politics. The United States' turn towards dialogue with Russia marked the beginning of a new era in international relations. Ukraine has been left out, and Europe is faced with a choice: follow the United States or look for its own ways to resolve the conflict. Ot Vivadite Vas Text Suda.